Thanks for joining us here on RT International. Straight now to the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov at the UN.
At a difficult and dramatic moment, crises are escalating. The international security situation is rapidly deteriorating. Instead of honest dialogue and a search for compromise, we have to deal with disinformation, blatant fabrications and provocations. The Western policies undermine trust in international institutions as bodies for reconciling interests and in international law as a guarantor of justice and protection for the weak. We see negative trends within the UN, which emerged from the rubble of German fascism and Japanese militarism, and was established to promote friendly relations between its members and to prevent conflicts. What is at stake today is the future of the world order. That is clear to any impartial observer. The question is whether it will be an order with one hegemon, forcing everyone to live by the notorious rules that benefit only them. Or will it be a democratic, just world, a world without blackmail and intimidation of those who are weak, without neo-Nazism and neo-colonialism? Russia has firmly chosen the second path, and together with our allies, partners and like-minded states, we call upon everyone to work together towards it. The unipolar model, which served the interests of the so-called golden billion of the West, whose overconsumption was secured for centuries at the expense of Asia, Africa and Latin America, is now a thing of the past. Sovereign states are emerging, which are willing to defend their natural interests. And this is becoming the start of an equitable, socially oriented and sustainable multipolar architecture. But these objective geopolitical processes are perceived by Washington and the fully subservient ruling elites of Western countries as a threat to their dominance. The US and its allies want to halt the march of history. After proclaiming victory in the Cold War, Washington elevated itself to the rank of God's messenger on earth, who has no obligations but only sacred rights to act with impunity as and where they please. Any state can be declared a zone for such action, especially if it has not pleased the self-proclaimed masters of the world. We all remember wars of aggression that were waged far from US shores in countries such as Yugoslavia, Iraq and Libya, and which claimed many hundreds of thousands of civilian lives. Were any of those countries doing anything that could affect the legitimate interests of the West? Did they ban English? Did they ban languages of other NATO countries? Did they ban Western media and culture? Did they declare Brits and Americans non-humans or use heavy weapons against them? And what are the results of the reckless actions of the US in the Middle East? Did it help promote human rights and the rule of law, stabilize the socio-political situation, increase people's well-being? Name one country where Washington intervened and where life improved as a result. In trying to revive the unipolar model under the slogan of rule-based order, the West imposes dividing lines in the spirit of bloc confrontation. You're either with them or against them. There is no thought option, no compromise. Continuing the thoughtless course of expanding NATO eastward, bringing the bloc's military infrastructure closer to Russian borders, the US has now proclaimed the task of subjugating Asian spaces. At the NATO summit in Madrid that was held in June, this so-called defensive alliance proclaimed the indivisibility of the security of the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific regions. Closed formats are being created under the banner of Indo-Pacific strategies, undermining the entire open and inclusive regional architecture that had been built up around ASEAN for decades. On top of that, they are playing with fire around Taiwan by promising it military support. It is clear that the notorious Monroe Doctrine is taking on a global dimension. Washington is trying to turn the entire globe into its backyard. Their tools to coerce dissenters is imposing illegal unilateral sanctions, which for years have been adopted in violation of UN Charter and deployed as an instrument of political blackmail. These sanctions are highly cynical as they hit the civilian population and prevent access to essential goods, including medicines, vaccines, and food. An egregious example is the US embargo on Cuba, which has lasted for over 60 years. The UN General Assembly has long insisted by an overwhelming majority that it should be lifted immediately. The UN Secretary-General, whose responsibility it is to facilitate the implementation of the General Assembly's decisions, should pay particular attention to this problem. The Secretary-General also has a special role to play in mobilizing efforts to address the food and energy crises that have erupted as a result of uncontrolled monetary issue in the US and the EU during the pandemic, and the EU's irresponsible actions in hydrocarbon markets. Contrary to basic common sense, Washington and Brussels have further complicated the crisis by declaring an economic war against Russia. This led to a rise in world prices on food, fertilizers, oil and gas. We welcome the efforts by the Secretary-General that helped to conclude the Istanbul Agreements of July 22nd. However, these agreements must be implemented. In the meantime, ships with Ukrainian grain mostly go anywhere but to the poorest countries, and the financial and logistical obstacles created by the US and the EU on the way of Russian grain and fertilizer exports have not yet been removed. 300,000 tons of fertilizer have been held up in European ports. We have long offered to give them free to African countries in need, but the European Union does not respond. The officially espoused Russophobia in the West has taken on an unprecedented scale. They are no longer shy about openly declaring their intention to inflict a military defeat on our country and also to destroy and dismember Russia. Russia seems to be a geopolitical entity that is too independent, that has to disappear from the map. What did Russia do over the last decades to actually infringe on the interests of its opponents? Could it be that they cannot forgive us for the military and strategic détente of the 1980s and 90s that was made possible thanks to our position, or that we voluntarily dissolved the Warsaw Pact organization, essentially depriving NATO of its purpose, that we supported the reunification of Germany unconditionally and against the positions of London and Paris, that we withdrew troops from Europe, Asia and Latin America, that we recognized the independence of the former Soviet republics, that we trusted the promises made by Western leaders not to expand NATO eastward, even by an inch. And when the process went on anyway, we agreed to actually legitimize it by signing the NATO-Russia Founding Act. Did we violate Western interests by warning them against the unacceptability of moving threatening military infrastructure to our borders? The arrogance of the West, the American exceptionalism, became particularly destructive after the end of the Cold War. Back in 1991, Deputy Pentagon Chief Paul Wolfowitz, while speaking to NATO commander in Europe Wesley Clark, frankly admitted that, quote, with the end of the Cold War, we can use our military without fear of punishment. We have 5 or maybe 10 years to purge these surrogate Soviet regimes like Iraq and Syria before a new superpower emerges that could challenge us. End of quote. I'm sure that someday we will find out, reading someone's memoirs, what American strategists really had in mind with regard to Ukraine. But I think these plans are already obvious. Maybe they cannot forgive us for the fact that we supported the agreements between the then Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych and the opposition to resolve the crisis in February 2014. The agreements were guaranteed by Germany, Poland and France, but were trampled upon the next morning by the ringleaders of the bloody coup who humiliated the European mediators. The West just shrugged and watched in silence as the coup plotters bombed eastern Ukraine, where people refused to recognize the results of the coup, and as the coup's organizers elevated Nazi henchmen involved in brutal ethnic cleansings carried out against Russians, Poles and Jews during the Second World War to the rank of national heroes. Were we supposed to put up with Kiev's policy of banning the Russian language, education, Russian media and culture, the demands to expel Russians from Crimea, or the declaration of war against the Donbass, where people were declared not human beings, but creatures, quoting Kiev leadership? Maybe Russia violated Western interests by playing a key role in stopping the hostilities unleashed by Kiev's neo-Nazis in eastern Ukraine, and then demanded implementation of the Minsk package of measures, which was unanimously approved by the UN Security Council in February 2015, but was ignored by Kiev, encouraged by the US and the EU. We have suggested many times over the years that the rules of coexistence in Europe should be negotiated based on the principle of equal and indivisible security, which is established at the highest level and enshrined in OSCE documents, where no one will strengthen their security at the expense of the security of others. The last proposal to make this principle legally binding was made in December 2021, to which we received an arrogant rejection. The unwillingness of Western countries to negotiate and the Kiev regime's continued war against its own people have left us no choice but to recognize the independence of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics and launch a special military operation to protect Russians and other residents of Donbass and eliminate the threats to our security that NATO has consistently created on Ukrainian territory, close to our borders. This operation is being carried out in pursuance of treaties of friendship, cooperation and mutual assistance between Russia and the republics of the Donbass, based on Article 51 of the UN Charter. I am sure that any sovereign, self-respecting state, which is aware of its responsibility to its people, would do the same. The West is now throwing a tantrum over the referendums currently taking place in the Lugansk and Donetsk People's Republics and the Kharkov and the Zaporozhye regions of Ukraine. But the people who live there are only responding to what President Zelensky recommended in an interview he gave in August 2021. In that interview, he advised everyone who feels Russian to go to Russia for the benefit of their children and grandchildren. This is what the people of those regions are doing now, and they're taking their lands with them. The lands where their ancestors lived for hundreds of years. It is clear to any impartial observer that for the Anglo-Saxons, who have completely subjugated Europe, Ukraine is just expendable in the fight against Russia. NATO has declared our country an immediate threat on the way to total US domination, and has also identified China as a long-term strategic challenge. At the same time, the collective West, led by Washington, is sending an intimidating signal to all other countries without exception. Anyone who dares to disobey can be next. One of the consequences of the crusade declared by the West against the unwanted is the progressive decay of multilateral institutions, which the US and its allies are turning into tools for the pursuit of their vested interests. These principles are now being carried out in the UN, at the Human Rights Council, UNESCO and other multilateral institutions. And the OPCW has been privatized, essentially, and fierce attempts are being made to prevent the creation within the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention of a transparency mechanism for hundreds of Pentagon programs, military and biological programs around the world. We know that these programs are far from being harmless. It is evidenced by stark facts that have been revealed in Ukraine. We see a trend to privatize the UN Secretariat and to introduce into its work a neoliberal discourse that ignores the cultural and civilizational diversity of the modern world. In this connection, we call for attention to be paid, as required by the Charter of the United Nations, to ensuring equitable geographical representation of member states in the Secretariat, so that no one group of countries can dominate. An intolerable situation has developed around Washington's failure to fulfill its obligations under the agreement between the Secretariat and the US with regard to the obligations of the host country of the UN headquarters to ensure normal conditions for all member states to participate. The UN Secretary-General has responsibilities in this regard. The efforts of some countries to undermine the prerogatives of the Security Council cannot be but worrying. Both the Council and the UN should be adapted to modern realities. But we see prospects for democratizing the work of the Security Council only if countries from Africa, Asia and Latin America get increased representation. India and Brazil are in particular key international players who are worthy candidates for permanent membership in the Council, and the profile of Africa must be raised. It is more important than ever that all member states recommit themselves to the purposes and principles of the UN Charter unequivocally and without reservation. It is the first step towards restoring collective responsibility for the fate of humanity. It is with this aim in mind that the group of friends in defense of the Charter, co-founded by Russia, and comprising some 24 countries, was established in July 2021. It aims to ensure strict adherence to the universal norms of international law, as opposed to harmful unilateral approaches. We call on all those who share this position to join it. In that context, the non-aligned movement, BRICS, the SCO, and ASEAN have considerable positive potential. Our Western counterparts are aggressively imposing their understanding of democracy as a model of social organization and they are imposing this model on all countries. At the same time, they are unwilling to be guided by democratic norms in international affairs. A recent example is the situation around Ukraine. Russia has explained its position in detail. The West has declared its disagreement. It seems that the rest of the international community should be left to decide for itself what position to take. Would they side with one of the parties or be neutral? It seems to be the case in the US when opposing politicians campaign for their view, trying to win the favors of the population. But in foreign affairs, the US and its allies do not give anyone the freedom to choose. They don't give anyone the option to decline to join the anti-Russian sanctions. They're not very successful in this. But it's obvious that their actions are far from democracy. It's clear-cut dictatorship, or at least an attempt at dictatorship. There's a strong impression that Washington and its subservient Europe are trying to maintain their hegemony, which is slipping away By prohibited methods, diplomacy is being replaced by illegitimate sanctions against competitors in the economy, sports, information, cultural exchanges, and human contacts in general. Take the problem of visas that had to be issued to delegates to international events in New York, Geneva, Vienna, and Paris. The hindrances that were created were an attempt to eliminate competitors, not to allow alternative views in multilateral discussions. This is their democracy. I am convinced that we need to protect the UN, to cleanse the world organization of all confrontational and superficial issues, and to restore its reputation as a platform for honest discussions, to find a balance between the interests of all member states. This is the approach that guides all our initiatives. It is crucial to push for a comprehensive ban on the deployment of weapons in space, which is the aim of the Russian-Chinese draft international treaty under consideration by the UN Conference on Disarmament. The protection of cyberspace also requires special attention, including an agreement within the General Assembly, open-ended working group on how to ensure international information security, and the development of a universal convention on combating the criminal misuse of information and communication technologies through the ad hoc committee. We will continue to support the Office for Counterterrorism and other UN counterterrorism bodies. We will continue to promote the dynamic development of the UN, its relations with the CSTO, EAEU, and the CIS, in order to combine our efforts in the greater Eurasian area. Russia calls for stepping up work to resolve regional conflicts. We see it a priority to overcome the current stalemate in the creation of an independent Palestinian state, to restore the statehood of Iraq and Libya, which was destroyed by NATO aggression, to neutralize threats to Syrian sovereignty, establish a sustainable national reconciliation process in Yemen, and overcome the NATO legacy in Afghanistan, striving to revive the original Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action on the Iranian nuclear program, to ensure a fair and comprehensive settlement of the problems on the Korean Peninsula. The numerous conflicts in Africa call for resisting the temptation to make them the subject of geopolitical zero-sum games, and we need to consolidate external players to support the initiatives of the African Union. The situation in Kosovo and Bosnia and Herzegovina is also concerning. The US and the EU are still working to destroy the international legal framework established by UN Security Council Resolution 1244 and the Dayton Peace Agreement. Ms. President, in times of change, one seeks comfort and solace in the wisdom of predecessors who faced comparable ordeals. In the words of former UN Secretary-General Dag Hammarskjöld, who remembered the horrors of World War II, the United Nations was not created in order to bring us to heaven, but in order to save us from hell. These words are more relevant than ever. They call for all of us to realize our individual and collective responsibility for creating conditions for the safe and harmonious development of future generations. This requires political will from all of us. We are ready for such honest work, and we are convinced that a sustainable world order can only be built through a return to the roots of United Nations diplomacy, based on the key charter principle of respect for the sovereign equality of states. Thank you.